All the schools we were aware needed a survey on the 4th of September have either had it or will have had it by the end of this week.
Okay. You mentioned
actually the good news is we're really working through, so we're doing well over 100 surveys a week. And obviously, we can't predict the future, but we feel, and as I said, there's, been a time lag as to where, the quality assurance. But we are working through them really well, and backlog is not our worry. We've got other worries, but backlog isn't this week's one.
You also mentioned that you have 80 caseworkers. Are they 80 in total working with those 174 schools?
Yeah, that's right. And again, forgive me, but to put it in perspective, there will be schools on that list that are in very strong trusts or very strong local authorities or dioceses, and they, we ring them up and say, can we help? And they say, thanks for the offer, but actually we're fine, and we've got space in other schools in our trust. So I spoke to a primary school up in just outside Gateshead, where they at the time had to close completely, and so the children were going to two other trust schools and another trust diocesan facility. So there are examples where they sort things really quickly themselves because there's capacity within the wider body, and there are others which are just much harder, and those might be, to Mr. Lear's point, single academy trust, but particularly, if you have to close a large secondary and you're in a central metropolitan area and you've got no outside space, that by definition is difficult, and that's where we really wrap around them, not just with the caseworker but also with the project director, and making sure they have our absolutely most experienced team, because those are properly hard to
just briefly
sort out.
Can you just say what the skills and expertise are of those caseworkers, please, Baroness?
Permanent Secretary, do you want to add a bit more? I know a few of them, but you probably know in more detail than me.
The caseworkers have a relatively wide range of generic skills, and their job is to hold the case, to communicate with the school, to make sure they understand the challenges and that they're sorting problems out for the school. We also have project directors assigned to every case, and again, as Baroness said, we look at the case holding for both the caseworkers and the project directors according to the kind of size and difficulty of the cases. So some of them will have more cases and some of them will have fewer and spend more time on each, and the project directors are part of our specialist capital teams, and so they're the ones who have the detailed and specialist capital skills. The caseworkers are more about making the connections and joining the schools up with the support they need.
Can I bring in Nick very quickly? Thank you.
Yeah, just to clarify something, the surveys now, are you just surveying to say that they are a RAAC school, or are you actually doing a survey on the condition of the RAAC as well?
We're doing
it was more simple now because
yes,
it was just...
the answer is the first one. So the answer is there RAAC? Yes, no. Where is it? Yeah. So we need to obviously know which parts of the school. So we have everything from, happily, one very large secondary was in a disused store cupboard. So then we know about Kingsdown School in Anna Firth's constituency, where it's a special school with very, very profound disabilities of children. That's a very specialist response, and I think I'm right in saying the whole school had to be vacated initially. So it's everything on that continuum.
I'm assuming there's no records from when these schools were built then.
You knew how many times we've asked that question, and actually
they're not comprehensive.
They're not comprehensive is the short answer, but some of them have gone back and found originals. So in the case I mentioned earlier, which I think is it Brand Hall, if I got that right, which was the one that last, forgive me, we'll correct the record if I've it's Brand something, which last time we thought had RAAC, they actually went back, found some...
Brand Hall, that's right.
Brand Hall is right. They found some building records, found that it was, I think it's called Bison. Bison. Yeah. So not RAAC, and that was very helpful, but that is not uniformly the case. And equally, I heard of a case last week of a school that had converted to be an academy there had previously been a RAAC survey, but it hadn't been given to the trust that took on the schools. So we've got every
On that
possible
question-
human permutation.
On that question of giving surveys to trusts, I think when you gave evidence to a PAC, Permanent Secretary, you said that the surveys would be shared with the responsible bodies when the DFE commissioned them. I have come across at least one case where a school, which is its own responsible body, has been told by the surveyors that they can't see the survey because it belongs to the DFE. Can you ensure that that is not happening? Because I think it is really important that if schools are being asked to prepare the groundwork for a second visit, they need to have the information as to where they need to prepare. And that information will be in the survey.
And if you let us know of that individual case, we'll sort it out individually, but that shouldn't be happening.
I
Okay,
just
'cause-
wonder if there was a delay, whether it was that QA gap between which I referred to earlier. So there could be up to 2 weeks while it's being quality assured. So that might have been, but we'll obviously follow up.
I think that would be useful because I think clearly with schools that are their own responsible body, the more information they can have, the better, and then work more effectively with the department to address these issues. That seems very important. I'll bring in Anna.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to ask some general questions about regional differences, impact on school and pupils, but then I'd like to ask particularly about Kingsdown School and Kingsdown School. Thank you. So obviously, many will know that a third of the pupils affected by RAAC actually come from Essex, where we've got over 31,255 pupils affected in 53 schools. Some might be interested to know why Essex is a particularly bad case. I'm more interested in knowing whether you are providing additional support for Essex and, in general terms, what that additional support looks like.
Thank you. So, I mean, I think, and Mr. Francois will know that we've had numerous conversations also about other schools.
We have,
in Essex. So I think why has Essex kind of floated to the top in the way that it has? I think there are some reasons which I think we can be confident in, and others are a little bit more hypothetical. I think the thing we can be clear about, and it was who I was thinking about when I said some local authorities have done an outstanding job. I think Essex have done an outstanding job. So, you know, if the committee have time to go back and look at what the guidance has repeatedly said to responsible bodies about know whether you've got RAAC in your estate, do regular condition surveys. Essex have done all of that, and as you will know, had already mitigated in the vast majority of their schools, and they are now intensifying their surveying programme. So I think one reason that Essex has become visible is because they did such a good job. And honestly, we say that many times a day within the department.
It is on to my second question, though, if I may, Minister. And in Southend, we are very grateful for the commitment of the department to engage with Kingsdown School, and we are looking forward to your visit, which we hope is going to take place next week. But as a generality, for Essex as a whole, are you providing additional support for the areas that need it?
If I may, in one sentence, the other hypothetical thing is, was there just something about the post-war building in Essex that meant you ended up with more RAAC schools? We don't know that till we've finished all of the national surveying. So in terms of the additional support, I think the main challenge that is thrown up when you get a cluster of schools is that of capacity in neighbouring schools to absorb them. And as you both know, and forgive me if there are other Essex MPs, I don't think there are on the committee, most schools in Essex appear to be bursting at the seams, and there isn't a lot of spare capacity. So that is the main difference when you get a cluster of schools in an area with very full other local schools. Where also, that's one aspect, and we have, as you may be aware, our Regions Group Director, Jonathan Duff, who's coordinating a lot of the work in relation to some of that coordination with the local authority and with trusts and with yourselves as MPs. We are making sure, not in every case, but in those particularly complicated cases like Kingsdown, that we put our most senior and most experienced people on them. But if there's more that you think we could be doing, obviously we're kind of open to that. But I think the point is, if we saw that emerge in another part of the country, we would do the same thing.
Have you considered having the same caseworker for the school as the MP? Because at the moment, and I don't know if others have found this, with Kingsdown School, I seem to be dealing with a different person at the department to the school, and it would certainly be helpful if we were dealing with the same person.
So let's take that away and see.
I mean, I can say something briefly about that. So one of the things we have done is we've put a single key point of contact for Essex in our technical team as well as in our regional team. Early on, we were trying to make sure that the caseworker's time was really protected to deal with and work with the school, which is why sometimes if you ring the MP hotline, you won't always get through to the caseworker, but you should always get through to somebody who knows what's going on at the school. I'm really happy to take it away. I think the thing we've been really keen to do is to make sure that caseworkers can face the schools and responsible bodies and keep doing the work at the greatest possible pace. But I hear the point, and we can look at that again.
Thank you. I want to ask one more general question, then I do want to just ask some particular things. So the general question is, are you in a position now to tell us how many schools actually you have been provided with temporary classrooms, please?
I'd have that
Also, according to the written parliamentary question, I received that answer I received last night. But if you can improve on that, that would be very welcome.
Could I loop back to that, because I know it's in here somewhere. But what, I'm not sure that we've got a specific number. What I can say is, I was sent some numbers last night. So of the schools where the mitigations are complete, only a small percentage of them required temporary classrooms. And I hope we'll get a chance, because I think there's been a particular focus on temporary classrooms, which maybe is a little bit disproportionate to how often they get used. So it's a small minority.
Well, they're hardly used at all. That's the entire problem.
Well,
can I just...
In a minute, we might go into that.
Yeah, I don't...
Sorry. So because the vast majority are either repurposing space within the school or are using other space in other local schools.
No.
Well, if we finish Anna's questioning and then we'll come back to Mark on that, because I think it is important
Minister,
that we go into the detail of that.
This is no criticism of yourself, because I know how hard you're working on this. However, it is incredibly frustrating when this question has been asked a week ago at the Public Accounts Committee and in writing and tabled on the 11th of September. A simple question: how many mobile classrooms have been provided to schools? And if it is a small number, it should be easy to count. And we get the answer 9 p.m. last night when we're preparing for today's hearing, and it is a non-answer. No answer. So this information really must be provided as quickly as possible.
Yes, please.
So, and I'm sorry it's frustrating, and I do understand that. I'm very happy to give numbers, but I would like to set them in the context that the Minister describes. So if you look at the first set of cases we had before the summer where we were acting on critical RAAC, what we found was that in many cases it was better to focus on remediating the space by putting things like a timber frame on the ceiling. And that gives you a better solution than putting children in a temporary classroom, and can be done relatively quickly. So what we don't want is to see the sort of success measure for the programme as the total number of temporary classrooms delivered. What we want is the total number of spaces that are usable by children. So I will give you the number, but I want to set it in that context. So of the cases that we had before the summer, we only had 7 which required on-site temp. So that is those we knew about before the summer. We now, combining those we knew about before the summer and those that we're working on now, we think that so far we are aware of at least 29 schools that we think will require temporary accommodation. Of those, 11 are in place, and that's a mixture of those that were provided centrally and those that were provided by the responsible body. Because again, we say to the responsible body, if you think you can do it faster and better than we can, then of course you should get on with that and we'll pay for it. At close on Friday, and again, these figures you should take with some caution, because what project directors will do when they have a school which might have a need for temporary classrooms or might be remediated through timber framing is they will often make an order for the temporary classrooms in a belt and braces way. So again, I will give you this figure because I want to be transparent, but I don't think it's a target, if that makes sense, because if we can remediate through timber framing on the classroom ceiling, that's often a better solution. But at close on Friday, project directors and caseworkers had made inquiries requesting potential orders and so when I gave that number of 29 schools requiring, that's not the number of rooms, that's the number of schools. So they've made orders relating to 180 single classrooms and 68 double classrooms and a mix of what I think are brilliantly referred to as hygiene facilities, which I think means loos.
That's 248 facilities. If that was available at close of play on Friday, why didn't we get that answer yesterday?
Sorry, that's the orders that have been made requesting.
Yes, but if this information, you had this information at close of play on Friday, a written question was put in on the 11th of September. Why wasn't it, by the chair of the Education Select Committee, why wasn't this information provided?
Right, this is the information accurate as of close
Yes,
of play on
so
Friday.
we've
we
been
also got
assembling
it
the
last night.
Data, so we also got this information last night.
It would have been a much more helpful answer to my written question, I have to say. And I think on this issue, though, there's also the question of how quickly can those classrooms be available. And I do want to bring in Mark
The
on that.
answer to that is going to be very variable according to the context.
So that's the number that you've ordered, but you closed some of these schools several weeks ago. You closed some of those in the summer. How many have been delivered?
So
Because if you order them, it takes a number of weeks to build them, then you have to transport them. There's a shortage of cranes to actually crane them into place. So how many, you closed some of these schools weeks ago, or parts of them, how many of these mobile classrooms have actually been delivered and are now being used?
So I don't have the most up-to-date figure for delivery, including the schools that were identified after the summer. As I say, of those
Why not?
before the summer... So
Forgive me, you've been asked, I'm guessing on behalf of the PAC this morning. You've been asked this multiple times at the PAC. You've been asked in written questions. You've now told us how many have been ordered.
I did also give you the number. I said there are at least 29 schools which require, with 11 of those have temps in place.
Yes, but how many classrooms?
So I'm very sorry, but I don't have the figure because it is changing very rapidly at the moment.
Well, do you have an approximate figure?
So it's sufficient that 11 of those schools have...
That could be one classroom each.
It'll vary a lot by school.
No, look, I'll tell you, sorry Anna, I'll tell you why this is unacceptable. Hockley Primary School, my patch, and I've learned from bitter experience, if you want to find out what's really going on, you ring the head teacher, not the department. Because the head teacher has to deal with all the angry parents, not your civil servants. So Hockley Primary, I was promised, sitting in Nick Gibbs' office, and by the way, Baroness, for the record, having dealt with you on 2 years, I pay tribute to everything that you and Nick have done on this. I know how hard you have both worked. But I was in his office in July. I was promised faithfully 8 temporary classrooms at Hockley Primary for the 4th of September. The civil servants on the screen, of course none of them are in the department, mind you, but the civil servant on the screen, yep, we'll sort all that out, that'll all be there. A week beforehand, I get an email saying, I'm terribly sorry, when we said the 4th of September, we meant mid-November. Now, this is after I, in good faith, having had it from the minister in his office, told all the parents, don't worry, they'll all be there for the 4th of September. Your officials came up with some guff about it was all to do with the ground was too soft. No, that was nonsense. They just didn't have the classrooms. How do I know that? I was on a call with some of them last week, and to try and mollify me, one of your capital department civil servants said, Mr. Francois, I can assure you those classrooms are being built now. I said, that's good, but if they were being built now, how are you then going to deliver them on the 4th of September? So to use polite language, someone's been telling fibs, haven't they?
No, absolutely not.
Yes, they have.
Absolutely wrong. May I take you through the sequence of events at Hockley Primary School?
No, just tell me how many mobile classrooms you've actually delivered. And then don't give us some waffle about you don't know. You're the permanent Under-Secretary. How many are in place now?
You have temporary classrooms on site at 11 schools.
We know that. How many classrooms does that make up?
I wonder if it's just helpful if we follow up in writing for each of the 11 schools, because the other variable in this is that sometimes schools will say, we've got a contract of our own, we can get them quicker.
Yes. Yeah, Baroness, you're right. And what has happened there, you're right, and I've learnt this the hard way, but your officials don't like that. They don't like the schools making their own arrangements. They only want it done the DFE way. That is what happened at Hockley.
So may I talk through the position at Hockley?
If you could briefly, and I will bring in Siobhan in because I know she needs to
I'm
step
happy
out.
to do that, but I don't want to take up the whole morning. But I can assure you,
A serious suggestion that people have not been telling the truth, and so I think it's quite important that we go through it.
If you could briefly.
So, and I'd be very happy to sit down and talk through this in more detail with you or with the head teacher or with anybody else. So my understanding is that initially the trust thought they had identified a contractor who could deliver more quickly.
yes.
And when the package was, so it is true that DFE will review those packages with the supplier.
Yes, and they had a disagreement and they wanted to use a different contractor.
But I can give you extremely specific reasons why the DFE officials were concerned about that proposition. It was because it did not have a turnkey element, it did not cover the fitting on site, there were a lot of things missing to the bid, and they hadn't looked at the grounds or the foundations. And so the reason they were promised earlier than they could be delivered was because that supplier hadn't gone through what we would expect to be gone through. What we've now done is, because that school is in the school rebuilding programme and will be fully rebuilt, we've worked with the supplier for the school rebuilding programme contract and the temps that will be delivered to the school, and I completely accept it's intensely frustrating that they will come later than the school had hoped.
2 months later.
But they will be temps that will be very good quality, and they will be in place for the school until its rebuilding is complete, which would not have been true if they're initially delivered, even if they had been able to be installed on the ground.
Suffice to say, I find your answer unconvincing. Why don't you write to us on it?
Very
One
happy to
last
help.
quick one. Bromford's secondary school in my patch. At the moment, they're going to have at least 1 year group who they can't educate on the site or elsewhere. They're going to have to be at home. And bear in mind, some parents get paid weekly, not monthly. So if you're told by the head you've got to take multiple weeks off work because there's nowhere for your child to go to school, that is a big thing. And I can see, Baroness, for the record, you're nodding. You understand that. Now, Bromfords are being told they may have to wait many weeks to get their temporary classrooms. When will the temporary classrooms arrive at Bromfords in Wickford?
The date we have for reopening, we think, will be no later than the 20th of November.
Right, so that's 2 months away. So what are the parents supposed to do for the next 2 months for that whole year group?
Well, I'm not sure that we can answer that, but in terms of what can they do, but they're just, putting temporary classrooms in sounds like it's a quick fix, but it very often is not a quick fix for some of the reasons.
Well, precisely, Baroness, because what I believe has gone here, then I'll hand back to the chair, is that ministers have been given these reports on RAAC. You've acted ultimately on child safety. I think everyone can understand that. But where I think there has been a problem is that you have been told that lots of mitigations are in place when those mitigations were not actually available. And the ground truth, when you speak to the heads, is very different from what your civil servants tell you and what your civil servants tell me. So the most generous interpretation I can put on it is there has been a lot of miscommunication. The less generous interpretation I've already given you. I would urge you to double and treble check everything, because at the end of the day, as I'm going to come on to later, it's children's education that's suffering.
You will write with more detail, I think, on that particular case. And Siobhan Bailey, I know you've got to step out, so I wanted to bring you in, and then we'll return to Anna.
There's an element of schools and parents, they want to see action, don't they? So the temporary classrooms are going to be the lightning rod, they're measurable, so all the steps taken. I'm just really interested in Mark's comment that where schools are able to source their own classroom, where they're taking a very constructive and thoughtful, sensible approach. I've got Marling School in my patch. They've got the whole of the DIT classes out, and obviously that's equipment heavy. It's a huge impact on the school. Teachers' health is struggling and things like that. They know that they just need 2 temporary classrooms. They need the green light from the department. They even know the amount of money, which is low numbers given what you're dealing with elsewhere. Is it the case that the department is computer says no because it's not, or is this what we can do as MPs with the caseworkers to make that case and just get things done quickly? Because fixing the roof in my DIT at Marling will take a number of years probably. I think we can get this done, and you can get me off your books as well. So what is the situation? How can schools work with you?
I think the situation, I'll try and make this as simple as possible, falls into 2 or 3 categories. So there's a school that I'm aware of, not in your constituency, actually in the West Midlands, where they need 3 large, let's call them generic temporary buildings, temporary units, because they need to replace their hall. Their hall is now out of use. It's quicker for them to use their own local supplier, and we think that those will be start to finish 4 weeks from order to reopen. And there's good access. So Mr. Francois mentioned about cranes. There are places where it's impossible to get these units in. It's messy in the real world, as we know. And they've got hard standing, so unlike the Hockley situation, they can put them down straight away. So that is probably as quick as it can be, and that's 4 weeks from the get-go. Right at the other end is a school in Somerset where they've got to replace 15 classrooms, all of their science blocks. It's got to go on quite soft ground. It's a big design job to work out where everything goes, where do the utilities come in, what's the planning. We speed these things through as quickly as possible, but you're effectively building a whole new school in temporary buildings. You can't just railroad that through with the community.
Able to make the cost-benefit analysis of, yes, temporary classrooms is the right. Are they able to do that quickly so we can just get on with it?
What I'm hearing back, but again, obviously there are individual cases that don't feel like that, and we need to know about that, and we're obviously aware of Hockley, but if there are others, we would be keen to know. I think cost benefit, of course, is very important, but actually getting children into the classroom is the most important thing. Yeah. So everything we've thought about in terms of funding for schools is how can we cut one more day off the any time any child is at home or in hybrid education. But please let us know, or let me know personally if there's any hitches, because the intention is to sort this quickly. But I think it is fair to take the Permanent Secretary's example where a trust thought they were doing the right thing, thought they were dealing with a supplier. Actually, the situation was more complicated, and it set us back with all the frustration that's caused. So there will be the really obvious, bring in your own supplier. The obvious, we're rebuilding a whole school, that's properly complicated and doesn't happen in 3 weeks. And then there are the ones in the middle that are messy.
In Secretary Baroness, very quickly, I think the problem is the department or parts of the department are still, if you like, if I can make an analogy, on a peacetime footing. And I think you kind of need to move to a wartime footing. You need to absolutely slice through all of the usual computer says no bureaucracy, it's a good way of summing it up, and move to a wartime footing and do these things far quicker because it's actually the education of the kids that is... I mean, can I offer you that thought to take away?
Absolutely, and point well made.
And I want to bring Anna back in, she's waiting very patiently, but just one other point I'd make on this is you've expanded your number of surveying companies that you're working with in order to meet the demand there. I think it's right to say you're working with the same 3 people for temporary buildings as you were at the start of this process when you were considering a much smaller number of schools. Surely there is a logic to you might want to be expanding your number of contractors in that space. But I'll leave that there and hand over to Anna.
Thank you. All of the context that we've gone through has been perfect background to my questions, and I want to raise Kingsdown School because it's the only special school in the country which is severely affected by RAAC. And as you know, these children have profound needs. We have cerebral palsy on site. There is the full range of autism spectrum conditions, complex neurological conditions involving a lot of specialist equipment and wheelchairs of the sort which need to control almost every movement that a child makes. Some classrooms need to have special temperatures, special lighting and sound. So this is a very, very special case, and I make no apologies for bringing this up in some detail. Now, there's a question of the short term and the long term. In the short term, and this is why I'm asking so many questions about demountables, there is still no confirmed date when 3 very necessary demountable classrooms will arrive on site. I went to the school yesterday. What the headmistress there, Louise Robinson, has achieved in the last 2 weeks is nothing short of a miracle. It's phenomenal what she's done to get all of these children receiving face-to-face tuition. More than 50% of this school is out of use, yet they need all of these specialist facilities. They can't access them because the corridors are out of use, and there are acros everywhere, and obviously with children in wheelchairs and some on actual stretchered beds from time to time, corridors with acros don't work. That cannot be even a short-term solution. But first of all, when are these necessary demountables going to arrive? Because, as we've heard, they're going to be an adverse load, so there's going to have to be accommodation for that. A crane is going to be needed. Southend Airport will need to be notified when this load comes along. There's going to be electrics, plumbing, and IT.
Making the case for complexity.
It's very complex, and they needed these yesterday. We understand the difficulties. They've made incredible arrangements to get one of the nearby schools, Eastwood Academy, has been incredibly helpful. I, as you know, in the course of one day on Friday, have managed to find 40 car parking spaces, so the demountables can go into a car park, and those spaces will be provided next door by David Lloyd, who are more than happy to help. So the whole community is here behind them. We need a date, and we need a date that we can rely on.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to have to write to you, I'm afraid, with a date, but I will do, and I will, and if we can't, obviously I will endeavour to give a firm date, but if not, I will explain what the steps are that need to be gone through, and absolutely make an undertaking to make sure that you're kept fully updated on that. Obviously, we're visiting together on Monday, the school, which I think will help me understand really well.
Thank you, Minister. And as I have said before, the engagement we've had from yourself and from Nick Gibb has been fantastic. And I know that you're working as hard as you possibly can on this. But because this is so complex, that underpins why we all need a single point of contact. Yeah. Somebody that knows this school inside, or will know this school inside out, quite literally, and one person that we all talk to. The second thing is, I think it's obvious from what I've said that this school will not be able to operate properly and give these children not only the education they need, but the actual sort of medical needs that they have, the physiotherapy needs that they have, and all the different therapies that are on this site. They're not going to be able to do this in the long term with only 50% of the school available. So what are the plans here? This cannot go on for months and months with children with these profound needs. So what is the plan, please?
Sorry, can I just clarify on the temporary units, because I've got one date, not 2 dates. So my understanding, and I know you're very close to this, so correct me if I'm wrong, is that we're procuring 3 temporary specialist classrooms and a staff room, actually, and that those will be, and the 4 temporary units, so the 3 specialist and the staff room, forgive me, are on track to be completed by the October half term. And as you say, my notes confirm that they're going to be placed in the staff car park, and then the staff are going to use David Lloyd.
Yes. That's
Forgive me that I couldn't find
that's correct, but I just want to be sure that you have taken on board, not you personally, Minister, but that your team, all of the complications around getting these classrooms there and up and running.
I mean, if I may, we have daily Gold Command meetings, and Kingsdown is definitely a school that has been mentioned, maybe not at everyone, but was that when we first took the decision was the first case we spoke about.
Thank you. But thank you very much for that. But can I push you, please, on what is the longer-term plan here? Because you cannot have these children trying to access physiotherapy rooms. At the moment, the kitchen is out of use because the corridor is out of use. We are approaching winter, when these children will need to have hot food. And they can't exist, but sorry to carry on, but these children really be taught for anything longer than a few weeks in temporary demountables with thin walls that will not be able to necessarily be heated and lit to the...
So I think we need to be clear about the quality of the demountables, and I will go back and check, but they tend to be extremely high quality and high specification. And we will go away and check these particular ones, but I can be pretty confident they're not going to be cold in them, but I absolutely hear your concern. I think there's just a practical thing, which is we're trying to get the mitigation in place so the school can function a bit more closer to normally, and then of course the next urgent thing is to look at the long-term solution, and we need to sort stage 1 first. We're not kicking it down the road, and we can start to talk about how we will approach that on Monday, but we do need to sort the first job first.
I think I've made my point.
Thank you. In terms of mitigations, you talked about propping as one of the potential mitigations.
Yeah.
How long is it safe or reasonable to expect props to remain in place in a classroom setting?
So I think there's been a bit, there's so many, I've learnt so much about mitigations in the last month. So props, which I think most people think of as, metal posts or timber that hold the ceiling up, to the best of my knowledge, are used in a tiny minority of cases. So where they are used and then the space is taken out of use is, I was at a school on Friday which has a 4-storey block, and the whole of the top floor will be propped, but there will be props at 1 metre intervals so that could you have a bit of water? Sorry. There'll be props at 1 metre intervals, so that space will come out completely. The more typical kind of where we use shorthand as propping, which doesn't look like the kind of propping we all imagine is where you put in effectively like a timber ceiling is the simplest way of explaining it. So the RAAC is there, you build a timber ceiling underneath it, you put back the ceiling tiles, you wouldn't know it was there, and if anything happened it would come down on the timber and is completely safe. So to all intents and purposes, it looks like a completely normal ceiling. That is the more common approach. That typically, depending on the size and the complexity of the space, takes about 6 weeks between design and installation. So some schools, and forgive me, Chair, if I've misanticipated where your question might be going, but some schools will go through different phases of mitigation. So I think we shared with you some photographs of some of the semi-rigid structures, which actually might look like a marquee from the outside, but when you're inside, they look like a normal classroom, and they're warm and they're soundproof and all of those. You might have those if there's space for a few weeks, then either your ceiling has been covered over in timber or your temporary units have arrived and so on. So there's...
And in terms of that timber solution, is that a permanent solution, or is that something...
Let's call it semi-permanent. I mean, it will last, I think, 10 years. I hope I'm saying.
I mean, the whole problem we're dealing with here is where building materials were put into schools with a life much more limited than the schools themselves. If the solutions last for a finite period of time, we need to have a clear plan to replace those solutions.
Of course.
And we've been clear in the commitment from the Treasury that we will be rebuilding or repairing spaces that have racks, such as to remove the racks. So the timber, the good thing about the timber solution is that it's as comfortable and reasonable to be under as the classroom is, and it has a long enough life that we can make sure we've got exactly the right long-term solution in place. So it takes the clock off, but it doesn't mean we won't want to do a permanent fix.
Yeah. And just, you mentioned the Gold Command meetings. So who's chairing those?
So the Secretary of State chairs those.
Thank you. I'll bring in Nick, who's going to come in on the impact on schools as well.
We need to get kids obviously back into school, but we need to get them into a safe school, don't we? So I'm just interested if they've looked at netting above suspended ceilings. You've talked about putting the timber frames in, but obviously we use netting when we're working on fragile roofs and things like that. So I don't know if that's been looked at before. Maybe it's something that could be. Have you looked at? It's a real issue with parents, obviously, if they've got children at home. Have we looked at other buildings within the community?
Yeah.
And is that practical at all? And even if it's not practical for maybe the younger children can go in the other classrooms and the older children can go to. So is that something that you've looked at? And just finally, really, with the ones that are actually having to work from home, what are we doing with regards to that hybrid working pieces, just like we had in the COVID? Obviously, we've had some experience of this before. So there's 3 issues there. I'd just like you to expand on a little for me.
So on netting, I haven't heard about netting as an option, and RAAC planks, as that sounds like are kind of 6 foot wide and could be up to 8 meters long. They were particularly brought in because of their span. So I don't know how strong netting is, but it sounds to me like a timber solution where the children's... I don't think as a child or a member of staff I'd be particularly comfortable under a net unless there was something underneath it, but that's just a personal... That's a personal view. But we can follow up and find out if that's being done. And how long it would last for, to the Chair's point, that we don't want to, this is...
It's used in construction when you're working on a roof above.
Okay.
So if you fell through the roof, it would catch the individual. So if it's safe enough to catch an individual falling through a roof, I would hope it would, especially on the corridors where you were talking about the SEND buildings, because obviously the span, it's the acros that are in the way of the corridors where we're netting. You need somebody who was obviously a lot more educated than me on that, but it's just an idea.
I just know from the school as I was at on Friday, they were talking about needing to prop to a weight that could take not just the roof but the snow that would sit on the roof, and they were talking about multiple tons per square metre of strength. So that's more than any of us weigh.
Yes.
So that was netting. In terms of community facilities, The answer is there should be no difference to a school, and a school that doesn't have space that it can repurpose, or a trust or a local authority with space they can give them in another school, should not be penalised financially for the fact that they have to go out and rent something. So if we're going to pay for their temporary classroom, we're also going to pay for where they need to use community facilities. And the example I mentioned earlier of the trust in Gateshead, they're using 2 of their schools and a church hall, so the children, it's far from ideal, but they are all in face-to-face education. And the third question was about, will we pay for the IT? Yes. I mean, the 2 biggest groupings of requests that we've had so far, and it's early days, is for transport costs, so where children need to go in a minibus to the church hall, let's say, and for laptops, dongles, etc.
And just briefly, is this what your caseworkers doing? Are they speaking with the school? Are they speaking
Correct.
with the local council? Are they being the go-between there?
So they are coordinating that.
Yeah.
The reality of the way that we're organised, and I can reassure you that as ministers we've asked, could we make it simpler within the department, is we have a group that look after capital funding and we have a group that look after revenue funding, which is the ESFA. So responsible bodies do need to talk to the ESFA and say that they need funding for something, like you've suggested, like renting the church hall, and have that conversation. That's paid normally on a monthly basis, but if responsible bodies have cash flow problems, we can do it faster. But there is the lightest possible, to Mr. Francois's point, there's the lightest possible kind of audit trail, so that both for the responsible body and for the government, we have a record of, what we spent on.
Anna on this point.
Very, very quickly, Minister, I'm delighted to hear you repeat what was said at the Public Accounts Committee, essentially that all reasonable costs will be reimbursed. But there is concern about exactly how that will take place and how fast. So for Kingsdown School, for example, invoices are still coming in, but they already total over £27,000. They will not be able to meet some of these, yes, because the intrusive survey was incredibly expensive, which went on for several days. So they won't be able to meet these costs out of normal revenue spending. So what will be the fast route? When will they receive a refund, and how will that be dealt with?
They need to talk to the ESFA. The ESFA's normal, I was going to say print run, but payment run is monthly. I'm looking at the Permanent Secretary to check I'm right. But it's very clear that if a school or a responsible body is faced with cash flow difficulties presented by that monthly timing, they should talk to their point person within the ESFA, and we can do more urgent payment runs.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Were you signalling you want to come back in?
Only very quickly. Again, on this point about the difference between a peacetime footing and a wartime footing, Baroness. Wyburn's Primary, who've been trying to relocate, the head there, as with these others, has been working her socks off. And at one point, they were being challenged over the cost of £50 for a whiteboard that the department were reluctant to cover. I mean, if they'd asked to build a helipad, I could well understand why the department would have bumped it. But again, I understand you're issuing updated guidance and saying that all reasonable costs will be covered. But what some of the heads have found, at least in the early weeks, when they're desperately trying to re-provide, is there was a lot of computer says no about revenue funding. So again, sorry to hammer the nail to split the wood, but we really do need a kind of wartime mentality in terms of, because in some cases heads have actually had to dip into their own pockets to pay for vital supplies that the department wouldn't sign off. Surely, please, we can do better than this.
We can do better than that, and we are doing better. And I think where I think you're right is when you say in the early weeks there was a bit more resistance. So as ministers, we have been crystal clear that we want this to be friction-free, and we should not be quibbling about small amounts of money. All of us, and you will know as a member of the PAC better than most, will ultimately be accountable for what we spend, so we need an audit trail, but we absolutely need the children to be back in class, and anything that helps that happen, then we need to make that work.
Well, amen to that, but can you please make sure that that promulgates down the
I
chain?
genuinely think, and you know, I need to know if it's not working like that, but my sense is that, and Permanent Secretary has been in the same meetings where, as ministers, we have been crystal clear about this.
Thank you.
So I think that message
Bring
has
back
got
Nick,
through.
and then we'll come to Kim.
I just want to go back to the caseworkers. It said there were a dedicated caseworker for each school. We've got 174 confirmed cases, but we've got 80 caseworkers. So are they taking on 2 each now? They're not dedicated.
And some of them, as I said earlier, some of them are really very independent, and the responsible body is saying, so first of all, some of them aren't that complicated. So it's a school which has got space they weren't using. They close, you know, they've got one classroom with RAAC. They close the classroom. They reopen the one that they weren't, you know, using, and they don't need much casework. We're grateful for those ones. And then at the other end, you've got Kingsdown or some of the very large secondaries, which are much more challenging, and then the caseworker and the project director. So it's a sort of, the caseworker, as the Permanent Secretary said, is kind of the coordinator of everything that's going on, but the project director brings technical expertise about what mitigations will or won't work, and is there on the ground physically visiting the school and working with them to try and resolve it.
The caseworkers liaising with each other as well, so they're sharing best practice and coming over
I want to talk about the sort of training and lessons learned, because obviously the first few days weren't absolutely...
So we
100%
that's
perfect.
right. We
I mean,
increased
they
the
were
number of
pretty
caseworkers very rapidly at the beginning of the process. So we had people who were new to the activity coming into casework, which I think may have explained why some of them were cautious on revenue funding requests, for example, early on. So we've been doing a lot of work to train them. They also have a collective meeting at the beginning and end of each day where they share experience and ask any questions. So one of the things we're trying to construct is making sure that if a caseworker is coming up against something tricky, they're sharing that with others so that others can learn immediately. So we're not doing it one-to-one. So we're doing that in a kind of battle rhythm sequence. So they meet at the beginning and end of every day and then work on the cases in between.
That's it.
Thank you. We're going to need to make some progress, so I'll hand over to Kim, but if we can make the answers clippier, that would be very helpful to get the committee through its questions.
Thanks, Baroness. And we'll note that RAAC is just part of a much bigger problem. You know, the cancellation of building schools for the future and the reduction of capital funding during 13 years of austerity has resulted in shocking conditions of school buildings. You know, and this has been highlighted by Unison and 6 other teaching unions, which has impacted both on pupils and teachers, you know, which has led to children not being at school, working learning remotely. But you mentioned on the 4th of September that any child who's eligible for free school meals would be eligible for a voucher. So I just wanted to know whether you could provide any information about that voucher scheme and whether the vouchers would provide a nutritious, healthy meal for those children at a cost of living crisis.
Yes, well, very good point. If I may, just on building schools for the future, because I understand why that, you know, is raised, there are absolutely schools that would have been part of building schools for the future, and we don't need to rehearse, you know, whether it was good value for money and all the questions that have been raised about it. But there are also schools where RAAC has been found which were part of building schools for the future. So I just think we need to be fair about that it didn't, you know, it didn't address RAAC in those schools, and we are now doing so. So I just for the record...
That's for clarification.
Sorry?
So thank you for the clarification.
I mean, it is what it is. In terms of free school meals and the vouchers, those are being organised, as I understand it, by the individual responsible bodies and schools.
That's right.
It's not centrally through the department.
No, that's right. So and we have a relatively tried and tested system for this, and schools will be making their own decisions about whether they provide a voucher or whether they provide a meal. So in some cases they'll be providing a meal rather than a voucher. But we're very clear that where children aren't in school, they should have access either to that meal or to that voucher.
And what would that meal consist of then?
It'll vary school by school. They'll all do different things.
Would it be a healthy, hot, nutritious
It will be a healthy,
meal?
yes, it's a meal that meets the school meal standards.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Mark.
Thank you very much. Baroness, you mentioned earlier the Secretary of State is now chairing Gold Command meetings.
And can I just clarify that? Forgive
sorry.
me. Our Chief Operating Officer chairs, but ministers all attend. Forgive me.
Right, but the Secretary of...
That's technically accurate,
Yes,
isn't it,
well, I can just talk through the rhythm of the day. So we have a ministerial gold meeting at the beginning of every day.
Right.
And
Who chairs that?
And that's chaired by the Chief Operating Officer, but attended by the Secretary of State and by Baroness Barran, and on occasion
Sorry,
by
you have a
Minister.
ministerial meeting that isn't chaired by a minister.
We find that ministers are able to contribute to the meeting and ask lots of questions better if there's someone else holding the ring and chairing it. It's relatively normal practice in a gold meeting. So because our Chief Operating Officer is the gold commander for the activity. So we have a gold ministerial in the morning.
Not in any meeting
and
I
then
was
we
ever in
have-
the MOD, we didn't.
then
But
we
anyway,
have-
go ahead.
Then we have operational bronze, silver and gold through the day, and then background to the ministerial gold in the morning. So we have a battle rhythm that runs through the day.
Right, so anyway, okay. I think one group we need to give credit to here are the head teachers.
Absolutely.
Because in many cases, the first the heads knew of this was when they got a call and or an email from the department on Thursday saying your school is not opening on Monday. Now, for any head teacher, that is an absolute nightmare. And some of these heads have been working 16-hour days. They've cancelled their summer holidays. They've dipped into their own pockets. Some of them have, for instance, the head at Kingsdown that Anna mentioned, some of my heads, they've worked incredibly hard. So the Secretary of State's remark that heads needed to get off their backsides was particularly insensitive. Now, I think what she meant was about returning the questionnaires. I think, to be fair, that was the context in which she said it. But if you're one of these heads who's been working their socks off, you can see why that wouldn't have gone down terribly well. So, Baroness, would you just like to take a quick opportunity this morning just to tidy that up and clarify that?
Well, so, I mean, I can only repeat what I said earlier, which is we are absolutely clear and have heard directly from many of you and directly from the heads that we've spoken to and visited that they have made superhuman efforts to keep their children in face-to-face education, sometimes in really complicated situations. And this isn't a sort of competition, but I would just like to put on record those heads who earlier in the year we surveyed their school and we said, you've got critical RAAC and some other RAAC, and we've got to take the critical out of use. And they were heading back at the end of the summer holidays thinking their school was going to be okay. And they got the message that having been through everything they'd been through, they now had to close the rest of the school. Those in particular, I would just like to put on record as our appreciation. I spoke to one of them. I don't know how you get through it.
Well, thank you. I'm sure that will be gratefully received. I mean, one of the schools in question, because when we as MPs found out the schools were closed, we didn't have all the mobile numbers. So I was ringing Headmaster A or Head Teacher A to try and get a mobile number for Head Teacher B. But if I tell you that one of a primary school in my patch that found out on Thursday that they weren't going to open on the following Monday, I only found out myself when I bumped into the head teacher in the gym on Saturday morning. So communications-wise, that's not exactly ideal, is it?
No.
Right, okay. So look, you said in the House of Lords on the 4th of September, I'm going to quote you, our children have been out of the classroom enough with COVID and this House knows the seriousness of issues with attendance. I had a year 11 pupil and her mother come to my constituency surgery on Saturday. I'm not going to name them, but they said I can repeat the gist of their comments. They attend Bromford School in Wickford, in my constituency. The daughter was, we'll call her Miss A, was very articulate. She made the point that in year 7, her education was interrupted by COVID, which dovetails with exactly what you told the House of Lords. Then last year her education was interrupted by the teacher strikes, which were not the department's fault. And now this year her education is interrupted by RAAC. And I think she just wanted me to convey to you the kind of stress and pressure that puts on a young person and their parents, who obviously want them to succeed, because of these endless interruptions to their ability to learn. Therefore, hence this absolute sense of urgency that I and Anna and other members of this committee are trying to promote. Hence, we need a wartime approach rather than a peacetime approach. But I faithfully promised this young lady that I would convey all of that to you. Have you any response to those comments?
Well, only to really, firstly, she obviously painted a very vivid picture.
Very articulate.
And sadly, she's not the only pupil who was in Year 7 and has been through this kind of pattern of disruption. I think the only thing I can say to her is we are working as quickly as we can to make sure that she gets back in a safe, warm, clean classroom with her classmates and her teacher, and she can carry on successfully, I'm sure, with her education. We're also working to make sure that we've spoken to, I'm right in saying we've spoken to her about to speak to Ofqual regarding, for some students, if there's very significant disruption, how might that be taken into account?
That's the other thing, if I may, and her mother was particularly keen to make this point. So if I give you one example, physics is one of the things that she studies. I think previously sometimes those doing that, were given a list of equations that they could have in the exam to take account of the fact that their education has been disrupted. She was very keen to know that when she comes to take her exams this year, those who've had to suffer from RAAC might have their, that allowed. I mean, that's just one practical thing that maybe you could pass back to Ofqual. But I cite it to make a wider point that I realise it's difficult for Ofqual, to what extent was each school affected by RAAC and for how long.
Exactly.
But I do, having spoken to this young lady and her mother, I do think, whilst maintaining the integrity of the examination process, we do need to try and take a fairly generous interpretation of this. And for someone who's had their education disrupted that many times, we should have some way of being able to, to look at this in the round. Is that something that ministers could follow up on?
I can see the chair's a bit anxious about time, so I can make my answer extremely brief, which is, schools get disrupted. I mean, some schools get disrupted every year. Ofqual is used to thinking about that. As you said yourself, some have been significantly disrupted and others much less so. So definitely we'll take that away and discuss that with Ofqual.
Anna, you want to come in off the back of that question?
Very, very quickly, we've talked about impact on children. I just want to raise impact on staff and give you the opportunity to praise the staff up and down the country who are doing a phenomenal job. At Kingsdown, they're all set up in a corridor. They're all carrying on. The staff classroom is now effectively, it looks like a shipping container block. It's outside the school. It's obviously got very thin walls. It's very basic. The staff toilet block is another, what looks like a sort of a shipping container, like demountable, which is further along in the grounds. And yet, when I went to see them, they are all, they're all upbeat for providing an education to the children. They are doing a fantastic job, and I'm sure you would just like to take this opportunity to praise them.
And I think it's massive pressure on them. And if I may, coming back to your fair questioning about timings of reopenings and delivery of demountables, I think the other thing I pick up when I talk to staff is just knowing that date and not missing that date is absolutely critical for them feeling like there's an end in sight and they can get through this, because for many of them, like Mr. Francois' example of the pupil, they feel like this is a return to COVID, and that is pretty soul destroying, but they are remarkable in their can-do attitude.
Those are the exact words. They feel at the moment that there is no end in sight, and we need to give them that end in sight.
And we are really focused focused on that. But if I may, Chair, it's just the worst thing we could do would be promise a date and then miss it. So for the vast majority of schools, children are already in, 83 or 84%, whatever it is, are already in face-to-face education. There are
full face-to-face.
Full face-to-face education. We've got one school fully remote, and then we've got a bunch in the middle. And the complicated ones are complicated, and I wouldn't want to pretend they're not. So we just need to move as fast as we can, but some will be slower because they're just more complicated.
I'm going to bring in Andrew, and then we're going to come to Miriam, but we've got a series of questions to run through. So,
thank you. So, broadening out again, what steps have been taken to communicate the UK's government's understanding of risks relating to RAAC in England out to the devolved administrations?
So I spoke to the Scottish Government myself, and I think colleagues spoke to the Welsh and Northern Ireland administrations. We've got weekly official level meetings. So we've set up a cross UK group on this. They had, the point being, we want to share knowledge, we want to share information about this. They met on Wednesday the 13th. All 4 nations were represented. Obviously, the individual administrations are responsible for how they address and resolve RAAC, but we are all sharing best practice. I don't know, Permanent Secretary, if you want to add a bit more. If there's time, Chair, we can give a bit more detail, or we can follow up with that in writing.
I'm very happy if you'd follow up in writing on that point, but I think, Andrew...
There's one specific within it, which is about the Health and Safety Executive. They're reviewing the latest technical information from DFE and have said that more information is due from the department. So I wondered when you're going to be able to update HSE with that information, what you're going to be able to tell them at that stage. And obviously a reflection that HSE's responsibilities aren't just for schools, as indeed this RAAC issue isn't just about schools, and how HSE's responsibility therefore fits with DFE's unilateral decision, for all sorts of reasons that you've already gone into, to make this announcement and the impact that therefore has on HSE's work, but therefore other parts of the built estate, both in the public and private sector.
I'm not aware of what the outstanding information is, Permanent Secretary, might be, but if not, we can follow up. I was in a meeting with HSC the other day, and it wasn't raised, so I would need to clarify exactly what that is. I think the broader point to the capability of the responsible body, is very different in different parts of the public sector and in individual responsible bodies, whether they be a small number of local authorities and a small number of particularly single academy trusts. We haven't felt as confident in that capacity and capability, which is why we've taken the action we've taken.
But you can see the issue that if DFE says that any schools with RAAC must close because they're unsafe, then obviously every other government department would feel inclined to do the same.
There is cross-Whitehall work going on in relation to that, which is being led by the Cabinet Office, and the Secretary of State and I have both attended meetings addressing exactly those issues, but it is very clear that the nature and capacity of responsible bodies in the education estate is different to other parts of the public sector.
Coming back to devolution issues, given that school buildings with RAAC were built prior to the devolution at the very, very end of the 20th century, is the UK government inclined to provide any support to devolved administrations to manage that issue?
So can you pick that up, Permanent Secretary, in terms of the funding issues for the devolved administrations?
Yes, obviously education in Scotland has been devolved for a lot longer than that. That's been a wholly separate system for a much longer period.
Since the 90s, which is obviously by the time RAAC had stopped being used in buildings.
No, in Scotland, education has been a separate system for a significantly longer than that.
The devolved government didn't exist until the 90s, so... It was a different system, but under a Scottish secretary appointed by Westminster.
I mean,
And then the system of education is irrelevant. That's the main point.
sorry, you're right. All I was saying is the education system in Scotland has been more separate for significantly longer than the existence of the devolved government. I think the thing I'd say is that in history, the responsible bodies for the estate have been local authorities, and they effectively transferred into the devolved government wholesale. So I think that responsibility effectively went with the devolution and took its history with it, if that makes sense.
So there isn't a responsibility for the UK government. So, I mean, perhaps slightly predictably, Welsh and Scottish and local governments have said, we want loads more money. But the argument from the centre, is it not that you've had the devolution, and the devolution goes with not just money but the responsibility as well?
I think that's correct. I mean, we'd follow the normal rules on bond and other formula for additional money that we were putting in. But at the point at which transfers were made, as I say, you had that kind of local authority overarching responsibility, and that kind of went wholesale, as it were. But
okay, thank you. So moving on, your colleague Diana Nick Gibb said that the DfE's response to the RAAC issue is, quote, world leading. I mean, what's the evidence for that claim, or is that just the sort of thing everybody in this country seems to say these days? Is there actually some evidence to support that? And are other countries affected by deteriorating RAAC in public buildings that you know about? And what's been their approach in order to make that assertion?
I think all of us know Minister Gibb, and he's not one to say those things without decent grounds for saying so. So I think what he meant by that is we know of no other administration that has proactively gone to try and find where RAAC is in every school in their school estate. And therefore we are, for better or worse, ahead of the curve in terms of knowing where it is. In terms of incidents internationally, I know the Cabinet Office have done a little bit of work in that area, but and we've spoken to the University of Eindhoven. There have been some incidents with another type of concrete, I think I'm right in saying, in Spain. I think one of the problems with the international comparisons, and I've asked if we can get an answer to this, is that we don't know if the kind of recipe for RAAC, if the technical specifications were identical in the UK from other countries. So we know that our factory happily, not normally happy when a factory goes bust, but I have to say I'm slightly pleased that the RAAC factory went bust when it did. But we don't know whether there was a difference in the specification here yet, but that's something that's being explored.
So would we in that case be world leading on our RAAC because we're the only country that produces that sort of RAAC anyway?
No, sorry, that's not at all what I meant. What I meant was, and what he meant more importantly, was we're world leading in establishing where it is and what risk it poses, whether or not, 50 years ago or more, it was made well or badly, none of us can judge. I don't pass comment on that. It was just that when we spoke to Eindhoven University, one of the questions they posited was there something different in the technical specification? We don't have an answer to that. It's just a question.
And is it also possible that if other countries use this material with an intended 20 to 30 year life, they actually replace everything that they had in place within 20 to 30 years?
It's entirely possible, but I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
Wouldn't want to look into. Miriam.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and be as brief as possible and collapse the questions into one. So just looking at school capital funding over the long term, some people have pointed out that since 2010 there's been significantly reduced school capital funding compared to the period before. Do you think had school capital funding continued at pre-2010 rates up until now, the crisis would have been averted or reduced, or would the lack of spending on RAAC buildings continued because the assessment of risk was unchanged and therefore the funding would have been allocated elsewhere, if you see what I mean? Would it have made any difference if we spent more on school buildings?
I think that there is a risk of 2020 hindsight in the sense that the first incident that we became aware of was in 2018. And as I mentioned earlier, there were schools that were rebuilt previously, which we have now found still have RAAC in them, part rebuilds, and the RAAC wasn't addressed. So I don't think there's a simple yes/no answer to it. I think also, to be fair, there was obviously a spike in capital expenditure in 29, 10, 10, 11 after much lower years previously. So actually, if you look at the kind of 10-year averages, the overall capital expenditure doesn't look like such a radical decrease as you suggested. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that since 2010, there have been there's basically three big strands of capital expenditure. One is school rebuilding. The second is condition and kind of repair and so forth. And the third is what we call basic need, which I'm sure you know, but for the record means building places to meet a growing population, which was obviously in sharp contrast to the previous administration. So we've been spending roughly £2 billion a year on basic need, whereas the previous government, the basic need wasn't there. But we're spending more like £500 million a year at the end of their period in government. Our expenditure on condition funding has increased quite substantially, particularly recently. So in the last spending review went up by 28% from 1.4 to 1.8 billion a year. And I suppose there is, of the many things we can be grateful to Minister Gibb for, that also the introducing the condition surveys and making sure that we knew that we could spend the money we had more intelligently was also very important.
So what you're saying is there's a political argument about whether there should be more money spent on school buildings, and even a political choice within government about how to prioritise money between departments. But even had you had double the money, let's say, it wouldn't necessarily have changed the types of schools that were being rebuilt because the knowledge wasn't there about the RAAC.
So I think that's fair. And so 2018 we had that information. You'll be aware that in our condition data survey, the second one, so from 2021, that survey is now specifically looking for RAAC. It's a visual survey, so to the Permanent Secretary's points about how long are the bearings, it doesn't get into that, but it does give a visual survey, which is, very useful in the vast majority of cases.
Thank you. So some of the remedial work will be taken out of existing budgets, but some of these schools will be moved into the Rebuilding Schools programme. What impact will that have on schools that are already in that rebuilding programme, like Windmill Hill and my constituency, but don't have RAAC? They are there for other but much needed reasons. Will they be bumped down the list, essentially? No. They will?
No, they won't be bumped down the list. They won't be bumped down the list because with perhaps, I can't quantify the number, but with a very small number of exceptions, the vast majority of schools with RAAC will have multi-year remediation solutions. So there may be one or two which are more urgent and you simply can't do that, but the vast majority will have multi-year remediation, and therefore there's no reason to bump.
Okay, so the aim for the number to be built each year is going to remain the same.
Correct.
Okay, but there may be some slight jiggling. So the government's...
As you will know, if I may, I mean, there's always a bit of rejigging because stuff happens in terms of planning permission or the contractors.
And post-COVID, it was difficult to find contractors.
Correct.
And things like that. So 50 schools per year is what the government's intending to rebuild, and I know every single school on that list is very pleased to be on that list, but that at that rate, 50 per year, the government is expecting each school to have a life of 500 years. Now, I'm sure Henry VIII built schools very well, but none of them are still in existence, or probably one or two. It's not realistic. Now, I'll go back to the idea, this is a political choice. What effort is your department making to persuade the Treasury that school building should be much higher up their priority list?
So the Permanent Secretary can talk about some of the history before I was appointed to the department, but the department makes, I think, a very strong and compelling case. I think where your question is going is that RAAC is not the only issue in the school estate. There are some schools with RAAC that are in the school rebuilding programme, in the 400 we've announced already, 400 or so, that we've announced already, but there are others with serious condition issues that
Around 2,000, I think the EFSA
need
thinks.
to be that need to be rebuilt. I think what we need to do is, before the next spending review, really bring together the data that we have on conditions. So colleagues will all have seen the NAO reports and our own estimates on the bill for all of the electrical work that needs to happen in schools, the mechanical work that needs to happen. So we need to bring those things together, because the last thing we want to do is replace a roof and then find that actually we have to tear the school down because there's some other issues. So I think we've got a big bit of work to do to pull that together to make the most coherent case.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Kim, you want to come in quickly?
Baroness, are you saying that real terms cut in capital funding has not impacted on the school conditions or buildings?
No, I'm absolutely not saying that. All I was saying was that the figures that get talked about, the 50% cut, take a particular peak in capital expenditure at the end of the last administration and compare it with a particular year. All I'm saying is if you look at the averages, and we all know that capital gets delivered in a kind of lumpy way, I'm just saying if you look at the averages, I'm not denying there isn't a decline, I'm not denying that hasn't had some impact, I'm just saying I think it gives a fairer impression of the scale of that.
Permanent Secretary, just in terms of the need and the spending, obviously the department has underspent its capital budget frequently in recent years, I think every year since 2020. How confident are you that underspends can be used effectively in this space?
Thank you. So part of the agreement we've got with the Treasury is that we can use capital underspends for the remediation work and indeed for longer term repair work where we need to. And we've been working very hard to try and make sure we are underspending by as little as possible and making the fastest possible progress. Some of that is related to the COVID-related construction delays that were mentioned earlier, but we take that really seriously. We want to be using every pound of capital we have to do this work.
And you mentioned agreement reached with the Treasury. My understanding is that's also said that the capital needs of buildings will be at the top of the list with regard to the next spending statement, and yes, which is understandable in the circumstances. But should we not be concerned that last time round with the spending review, the top of the list was SEND and the delivery of much needed SEND places, which are an essential part of the right place, right time support? How are we going to ensure there is sufficient capital to continue with that programme alongside this?
So we're really proud of the settlement we got for SEND in the last spending review, and we know how important it is, and we're delivering as rapidly as possible on the execution of those places. What we've agreed with the Treasury, again, to enable us to make the commitment that we will address every school that has RAAC and that it'll either be repaired or rebuilt. We've said to the Treasury we will make that our first call on the next SR, but that doesn't stop us making the case for other much needed funding, including SEND funding. And I know from the conversations I've had with them that they will be really sympathetic to SEND funding capital asks. They were in the last SR. They understand both the need and actually the value for money case of making sure those places are available. So making school condition the first priority does not stop us having conversations about other need and other priorities. And I think I said in the last hearing, and it links to the Minister's point about basic need, we should also just note that we've had to spend quite a significant proportion of the department's capital budget in recent times managing that quite big increase in pupil numbers. We're just about to top out and start moving down on pupil numbers. They're already declining in primary, and that bulge is moving quite rapidly through the secondary system. And so the need for what I would expect you to see squeezed in the next SR is not send places, but the amount spent on basic need, and that will be perfectly reasonable because the amount of basic need will be going down.
That's useful. Anna.
Thank you. Because it arises directly out of your comments, my understanding is that the school rebuilding programme is a 10-year programme. So at some point, you may not have it today, but we will need the estimated timescale for the repair works to be completed for these schools, not the remediation, the repair works. Yes. Because I'd like you to confirm that it's not the plan that some schools will be waiting 10 years for RAAC to be removed. So we're going to need that repair plan, and as I've said earlier, the game plan, the wartime plan, if you like, for the schools to operate in that repair period.
Yes, and I think, again, just to say something really briefly about the mechanism from getting there, because I completely understand that. So in every school that has been identified as having RAAC, we will work with them immediately on the mitigations they need now, but at the same time, the project directors and others who are working with them on the immediate mitigation will also be doing an assessment looking at what's needed in the longer term, and we'll do that proactively. So I think one of the things I think schools really want to hear is that we aren't going to ask them to go through some kind of bidding process for this. We're going to go and actively work with them, do an assessment of what's needed, whether a repair is the most appropriate response, or whether in some cases whole blocks or other parts of schools need rebuilding. And then we will sit, as the Minister said, we need to look at that whole picture together and then work that through with the existing school rebuilding programme plans, not because we're going to delay anybody who's currently got a date in the programme, but because we have 100 spare slots. One of the things we've spoken to the Treasury about is it is possible that we will have more than 100 schools with a rebuilding need, and that agreement that they will make this a priority for the next SR will allow us to increase the total number if we need to. So if we have more schools that need rebuilding than we have slots, we will increase the size. And then we will also look at the phasing and the timing, which is both about need and about the practicalities of what we can do when, which we do as part of the school rebuilding planning anyway. And Ms. Cates asked about 50 schools a year. If we can, we will look at whether we can deliver more than 50 schools in some years in order to make sure that we aren't extending the programme by just adding to the 10 years. Yeah. But again, that will be done on the basis of really active assessment of what's needed in each school, when we can do it, and how we can make sure we're getting the works on site.
I understand that, but you still haven't answered my specific question, which is if a school has so much RAAC in it that it will need to be part of the school rebuilding programme, and I would suspect that Kingsdown may well fall into this category, how are they going to operate during the time which the school rebuilding is taking place, given the very, very special needs of these children?
Sorry, you mean while the school's actually being rebuilt?
Yes.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I apologise. So our contractors for the school rebuilding programme will work really carefully with every school to make sure that there's a really well worked through plan for how they operate while the rebuilding is taking place. So what we typically do, wherever we can, we'll build. So it varies a lot according to the circumstances of the schools and SRP. So in some, children can stay in the old school while the new school is built alongside. We usually try and make it so that both can stand up at the same time. We've got some really good examples of that. So West Coventry Academy, which was handed over in August and opened this year, pretty much dead on 2 years after the work started, which is pretty good for an entire secondary school. Yes. The plan was created so that the new school could go up alongside the old school and children could be educated in the old. If the old school can't be used in that way, which will be the case for some of these RAAC schools, we'll make a similar staged plan that allows for really good quality temporary accommodation. And again, if you look at the images that we circulated, temps come in varying quality. And again, this links to the point I made about hotkey.
Sorry to butt in, but what I'm really saying is you're going to have to work really closely with these schools, because you're going to have to rebuild bits and then move children into the rebuilt bit, because you can't have acros through a school like this for a 2-year period.
Have a very clear deadline of when it's all going to be done as well. That's the other point.
So we do work really closely with schools through the school rebuilding programme on those staged plans for moving people out and back in again.
Yeah.
And for a school like Kingsdown, I would expect that to be even more important, so that the facilities we will source will be specialised, and we will talk very closely with the school about how we manage that.
We've overrun our time. I hope you don't mind staying for a few more minutes to answer the last few questions. I think there are some important points just to touch on. But can I just ask, lessons learned from all this? How do we make sure going forward we make sure that there aren't life-limited building materials being used in schools? And Baroness Barran, are you confident that in terms of the guidance and the information that the department now uses for building new schools or repairing existing ones, we have the right approach in place to make sure that life-limited building materials aren't being used?
Well, I think it's as good as it can be on the knowledge that we have. I think what we've all learnt is, and I've been talking quite closely to our Chief Scientific Advisor in the department, is actually just how little detailed research there is on a number of these issues. So it's as good as it can be. He is working closely with his colleagues across government and thinking about all of the issues that you've raised, and you'll be aware from the NAO report that we are doing a kind of research programme later this year into other so-called system builds, not because we know there's a problem, but just to exclude. So you'll remember that Langspan and Intergrid were the first two system builds we worried about. Those went early into the school rebuilding programme, or maybe its predecessor, forgive me. But we are really working very proactively on all of those issues because it's clearly critical.
That doesn't sound, I mean, it's a definitive answer you've given. I wouldn't say it necessarily shows that you're entirely confident, but we can be certain these issues aren't going to arise in the future.
What I'm confident about, if I may, is that our technical team within the department are extremely proactive. They have been actively going out looking for cases and learning from them. They're really closely involved with all of the industry bodies and have kind of active roles within them. So I think that we're in a good place in terms of our competence and expertise. But what I can't reassure the committee is that we don't, that somebody somewhere doesn't find out something new. It's a kind of unknown.
Thank you. And I'll hand over to Mark. I mean, it's worth noting, I think, the points that were made by the chairman of the Public Administration Committee on this issue about the need to potentially look at this cross-government and the potential that the HSE might not necessarily be the right body to hold that responsibility when it comes to construction in particular. But I think that's, I'll leave that one.
I'll try and be brief. So Baroness, we all share and PUS's frustration about the small number of responsible bodies that haven't yet responded to the questionnaire. Hopefully before long, not least under moral pressure, you will get your complete response. You're surveying at about 100 a week. You take on extra surveyors to do it. So hopefully before too long, as it were, you should have a fairly comprehensive picture of what you're up against. The number of schools have gone up from 143 to 174. I'm not going to put a total number on it, but maybe it will go a bit above 200, who knows. But then at least you know how many schools you have to remediate, how many you have to rebuild, and then presumably, Miss Acland-Hood, once you've got a reliable number on that will then better inform you going to Treasury if you need more than those 100 extra slots in the school rebuilding programme. Is that a fair summary of where you are?
Yes. And
Thank you.
In an ideal world, we would also bring in the other data that we hold through the CDC and other surveys to make sure that we're not just kind of looking through a narrow lens at the RAAC issue, but we're looking at the building.
Well, that takes me on to, thank you. Well, proves we've been listening to you. So that takes me on to my last two. Asbestos. Now, it's important, I think, not to be alarmist about this. I've learnt a lot about this. I've had some on-the-job training, Baroness, because of what happened at King Edmund in Ashington.
You and I both.
Yes, but my layman's understanding is that asbestos is generally safe if it's left where it is in a water and it is undisturbed. It's if you break that up in some way and it crumbles and the fibres are exposed to the air that it may become dangerous. So providing you don't do that, it is relatively safe. That is correct, yes? Good. So I think it's important to get that on the record. And also, there will be some schools which are affected by RAAC, but which are not affected by asbestos, and some which are affected by asbestos and not by RAAC, and some which unfortunately may be affected, as it were. There'll be a double whammy. What are you doing in order to be able to cope with schools in that latter category? Baroness.
So they are a bit more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So the first complication is the asbestos is normally underneath the RAAC. So one has to get a particular technical approach to make a kind of hole in the asbestos safely to be able to put in a camera to look at the RAAC. So that's the kind of first literally physical barrier. And then, as you know from the school in your constituency, then the asbestos, if the RAAC needs replacing, then the asbestos might need to be removed at the same time. I mean, we are experienced in dealing with those things. In some cases, each case will need its own approach, but we have experts within the department who will address those issues as and when we find them. I don't know if there's more to add on that, or is that...
I mean, I think that was perfect, given time. I don't know.
So in short, you promised me that lessons will be learned from what happened at King Edmund, and so as not to delay the committee, those lessons have been taken on board.
Absolutely.
Yes. Right. Lastly, on top of all your other challenges, so in many schools you've got electrical services, mechanical services, heating and ventilation, old boilers that need replacing, and I think mainly you've been addressing those by the Condition Improvement Fund, the CIF fund. How, given all of these other challenges, are you going to make sure that the department is able to deal adequately with those things as well? Because it's one thing to have an issue with RAAC or with asbestos, but it's also another thing if children are shivering in a classroom and it's too cold to learn.
So you mentioned the CIF fund, but the CIF fund, of course, is for smaller trusts, and the school capital allocation, the SCA funding stream, is for the larger trusts and local authorities and and the diocese. The advantage, as the committee knows, of the SCA funding is that it gives that responsible body visibility on its funding stream going forward, and it allows it to plan those repairs in the most coherent way possible. But I think I've tried to answer that already. We are absolutely aware of it, and I think it is when we make those decisions about repair or rebuild, part of the rebuild question will be how much else needs replacement in the school, and if it's above a certain size, so our criteria historically has been more than 300 square metres needs to be rebuilt,
right.
Or if the severity is sufficient, then it tips it into the rebuild rather than the repair.
Thank you. Well, look, perhaps we could, before I finish and hand back to the chair, we could end on a consensual note. Thank you for answering all of our rather probing questions. That's our job. But perhaps we can give you an opportunity just to thank again all the staff and pupils and parents and particularly heads who've had to struggle with this extremely hard, and also to acknowledge that a lot of officials in the department have been working extremely long hours on this too. So I think you've heard from a number of us, including the chair of the committee, that's our view. I take it you would echo it.
Completely, 110%.
Thank you very much, Chair.
I'm very grateful for your time. There are a number of things I think we'll be writing to follow up on today, and I think you have given us some valuable new information in terms of the process there. I think there has been an incredible response from the sector and from so many people in our schools, for which I think we're all profoundly grateful on this front. I will call the meeting to a close on that point and say order.